Hi guys, this is the table saw, and we're going to talk about the safety and use of the table saw and some of the primary uses that we have here in the shop at SP. So the table saw is made up of obviously a table, a blade, a fence, and some other accessories that we'll get to in just a couple of minutes. The primary use for the table saw is to make rip cuts, which is cutting with the grain, and to make cross cuts, which is cutting across the grain. So first I want to go over just a couple of things, and that would be some basic setup, whether you're doing rip cuts or you're doing cross cuts. First thing is we're going to look at how to set the height of the blade. On the front of the machine where I'm standing, there's a hand wheel that is below the machine down here, and this will adjust the blade up and down. So if I crank the hand wheel in a clockwise direction, it will move the blade in an upward direction. And you can see the blade coming up above the table right now. There's another hand wheel that I want to point out. There's a hand wheel on the left of the machine. This hand wheel controls the tilt of the blade. We probably don't want to make any adjustments to this unless the blade is not at the correct angle. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, let's take a look at setting the correct height of the blade for the table saw. The first thing you'd like to do is get the board that you intend to cut and put that board near the table saw blade. When you're making your adjustment, you're going to want to adjust the table saw blade so that it is about 1 tooth above the surface of the wood. And the number that we use is 1/4 inch, which is roughly the size of about a pencil. So you don't want to have too much blade sticking up above the surface of the wood. That would be a nice adjustment right there. The next adjustment we're going to look at would be to check the blade to make sure it is square to the table. And so what I'll do is I'll get a tri-square, and I want to put the tri-square on the table part of the table saw, not on the throat plate part of the table saw. And I'm going to slide that square up against the blade, making sure that the blade of the square is not touching a tooth. If it touches a tooth, I'll wind up getting a little bit of a gap in there, so we'll see if we can do that. So that's touching a tooth, and you can see a little bit of light sticking through, and if I just go beyond that tooth, I can bring my blade of the square all the way up against the body of the table saw blade and verify that it is at 90 degrees angle. Always check to make sure your blade is square. You just never know what the person ahead of you might have done. Now let's talk about setting up the saw specifically for making a rip cut. This steel plate right here with the 2 holes in it is called the throat plate. And I'm going to put my fingers in those holes and lift that up carefully and remove it from the throat of the saw. Please try to be careful about not bumping the throat plate into the carbide teeth, because those carbide teeth can be chipped if you're not careful. I'm now going to show you guys a device called a splitter. The splitter is designed to line up with the saw blade and prevent the board from drifting away from the fence and keep the board separated as it makes its cut. The splitter is designed to fit into a mechanism right down here inside the table saw. There's a small black knob, and if I pull to the side, that black knob will release a pin. You'll notice that there are some holes in the end of the splitter. And what I want to do is drop the splitter down into the groove and let that splitter index on the last hole. You'll hear it snap into position. I think I got it on the first shot there. There it goes. The splitter has snapped into position. And very important, on the splitter are a pair of anti-kickback fingers. The anti-kickback fingers only move in one direction. If you put the splitter in backwards, which is possible, then you might not be able to complete your cut because the anti-kickback fingers won't move out of the way. So make sure that the anti-kickback fingers are in a position that they will move upward as you push your piece of wood through the saw. Now I'm going to put the throat plate back in place, and please do that carefully so that you don't bump that into the teeth of the saw when you put it back in. Make sure that it's flat and make sure that it is installed correctly. Okay, next item is we're going to talk about the fence. The The fence is the item that controls the width of cut on the board. And the fence can be locked in at the desired distance from the blade to the fence itself, which will tell us how big the cut will be. The fence has a tape measure. And there is, right here, a witness line. That witness line needs to line up with whatever size you need your fence to be set at. So let's just say I'm going to set this at 4.5. I'm going to set the fence back in place. And you can see the reading on the tape measure there is about 4 15/16. So I'm going to push the fence over until I get close to 4.5. Then what I need to do is start to lock the fence. It starts to move the fence in position, and I'm just a little bit past 4.5. So a good way to adjust that is to just loosen that fence mechanism, that knob right there, just slightly, and then tap the fence until you get it exactly where you want it, then lock the fence in place by pushing downward on the knob, and that locks the fence in place. So we're set at 4.5. Okay, next item on the agenda is we need to look at the guard. This is the blade guard, and the blade guard has 2 directions that it moves. It can move outward towards the blade, and it can move up and down. What I recommend is that you grasp the blade guard up here on the top and lift up just a little bit to take the weight off of this bar as you slide it in that direction. What you might need to do sometimes is actually walk to the other side of the table saw, lift up on the blade guard, and then slide the blade guard until the blade guard is relatively centered over the table saw blade. Then we want to drop the blade guard into position. This knob is a spring-loaded rod, which if I pull backwards will compress this spring, pull the rod out of the keeper, and allow the blade guard to drop down over the blade. Looks like I might need to move it over just a little bit. I've kind of cramped the space between the blade guard and the fence, and I want to have a little more space in there for making my cut, so I'll make a minor adjustment. That gets my blade guard in a little bit better position, and it's ready to go. So let me just demonstrate how that blade guard works by sliding the board under the blade guard. You can see that the blade guard will lift up, it will stay in position as I make the cut, and as I complete the cut, the blade guard will drop back down onto the surface of the table. So this completes the setup for a standard rip cut. Quick review on setting up for a rip cut. I want to check my height of my blade to make sure it's about a tooth above the surface of the wood. I want to make sure that my splitter with anti-kickback fingers are installed correctly and that the throat plate has been reinstalled into the saw. I want to make sure my guard is installed in a correct position and that the guard is downward on the table and that I have set my fence for the correct width of cut for that particular operation. Okay, let's make a rip cut on the table saw. I'm going to have a 4.5-inch rip cut, which means that I am inside my 6-inch margin of safety. Therefore, I'm going to have to use a push stick to push the board through the table saw. If I were to use my hand would be too close to the blade, and that would cause me to be inside the margin of safety and could be a dangerous operation. So I'm going to use a push stick that's going to help me push the board through the saw and exit the board on the other side. So let's do a test cut on the table saw. The on-off switch on the table saw are in an interesting location. The on switch is inside this hole. There's a green switch in that hole, and if you push that switch, it will turn the table saw on. The off switch is this entire board, which acts as a little bit of a safety. What I can do is turn the saw off by not letting go of the board by using my foot to turn the saw off if necessary. I can also use my hand by pressing on the board to turn the saw off. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the saw on, make the rip cut, and then turn the saw off. Wait until the blade stops to clear your scrap piece of lumber, and that completes your rib cut on the table saw. Remember, this would be one full board when you start the cut. 3 things that you need to make sure happen when you make a rib cut. 1, stand slightly to the left of the board and the blade. 2, make sure you are holding the jointed edge up against the fence. So you put a little bit of pressure with your left hand against the board, holding it up against the fence as you begin pushing the board through the saw. 3, make sure that when you make the cut, you pass the board all the way through the saw, moving your left hand out of the way and making the board go all the way past the splitter. So let me go through that one more time, just so you see what I'm talking about. 3 important things. 1, stand to the left of the blade. 2, hold the board with the jointed edge against the fence. 3, pass the board all the way through the saw so that it exits on the other side past the splitter. Woodshop safety videos, take 1.